My name is Aaron Cato, Extension Specialist for Horticulture IPM at the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture. Today we will cover two common strawberry fruit rots that you are likely dealing with and how to properly and sustainably use a preventative fungicide spray program to avoid losses. These recommendations are designed for annual plasticulture in the Mid-South growing region. Let's get started. We're going to talk about foliar fungicides. If you're growing strawberries in the Midwest, in the Mid-South, or in the Southeast, you definitely have to use foliar fungicides to manage a few important diseases. The two main ones that we are talking about here are the ones that are infecting the plants, specifically infecting the fruit. And so that's really what your foliar fungicides in the springtime during flowering and harvest are targeting. Now, you do get a lot of control of other small diseases, maybe some of the leaf spots and things like that you're not worried about, but this is what you're targeting. And so botrytis gray mold, you'll see it referred to as botrytis fruit rot or gray mold. It's the exact same thing. We're going to call it, I'll probably end up calling it both things, either gray mold or botrytis during this. And then anthracnose fruit rot, which all of you probably know is anthracnose. And you can see up the top here, those little sunken black lesions, that's what anthracnose is. And then botrytis is going to be that gray fuzzy stuff you see. A lot of times it just looks like the cap turns brown and kind of gets fuzzy around the cap, or you see flowers just kind of die. And that's a lot of the damage you get. It's just killing the flowers. And so the foliar sprays that you use are actually killing pathogens and to some degree protecting your flowers and your fruit. But let's talk a little bit more about each disease just to orient you for the spray schedule that I'm going to provide, because there's some reasons behind what we put in there. So let's look at these two diseases. Botrytis fruit rot or gray mold, that's over here on the left. We know it thrives in moist, damp, or war environments. So basically, once your strawberries are happy enough to flower, botrytis is probably happy enough to start infecting the flowers. It's moved via the wind. That's important because we've always got a little bit of wind. It can actually burst and release some of its spores. And so it's moved very easily in our production systems. And so that's important to know because this is something that's going to be easily moving in your strawberries on a normal day, normal, somewhat 60 to 70 degree day, and even a little warmer. The main worry with this is when it infects the flowers, and then what happens is you'll see it later on this fruit. So it can either kill the flowers or it lays dormant in the plant or dormant in the flower and fruit. And then once it develops, turns or starts molding afterwards. And you've seen that before probably, where you pick fruit, put it in a clamshell, and then you get the gray mold. It generally doesn't infect undamaged fruit. And so unless you're getting a lot of rain and standing water on your plastic, you're probably not going to see any damage from an infection that occurred when you had fruit. If you get a hail event or just kind of nicks on the berries, or they start standing in water, then you can get some botrytis on the fruits. Anthracnose, it favors wet and warmer environments. So anthracnose is moved around via rain splash or water droplets. And so unless you're getting heavy rainfalls to some degree, this is probably not moving around. Now, you can move it around yourself. If you're working strawberries in the early morning when they're still damp, you'll move around water and dew enough to actually move anthracnose. So that's something to think about when you're worried about anthracnose. Don't really get in the fields too much. Generally favors a bit warmer, so closer to 70 degrees into 80 is when it's ideal. But, we still see infection a little early, or, around 70, upper 60s, but mostly 70s to 80s is where it gets bad. The big caveat here is that it infects flowers and green or red fruit. So what we see is a lot of flower infection occurs. So when you protect the flowers, you're protecting against both gray mold and anthracnose. But then once you start getting a lot of rainfall and it gets splashed around and it's kind of warm out, which we see in April, May, then you start seeing more anthracnose. So let's talk about our sprays and how we target it. So we just talked about the biology or the disease cycles of these. So botrytis, we want to begin our protective sprays once we start seeing fruit or seeing flowers that we're not going to make it through. Generally, that means we like to say greater than 5% of your planting. But basically, you'll look out in the field, you're starting to see flowers on the plants. Okay, I'm expecting these not to die from freeze. Start your spray schedule. Timing your last spray, that's a big caveat on rain. But a lot of times people used to say you could time your last spray based on your preventative whenever you thought you weren't going to take flowers or fruiting at the end. But we just talked about anthracnose. We're doing some work right now with, some of the money that's funded from the MASGA group Or basically what we're saying is you got to spray through the last harvest because anthracnose is going to infect your green fruit and red fruit, especially late in the year. So you're going to need protective sprays on flowers, even somewhat earlier in the year, but you're going to get fruit infection later in the year when we get these rain events, when we get big swings in temperature, which we see every single year. And it'll take over if you're not doing a good job spraying for it. So let's talk about the basis of this fungicide spray schedule. So on the right here, this is just a table I've pulled from the 2022 Southeast Regional Strawberry Integrated Pest Management Guide. It's a big mouthful, but it's on smallfruits.org. This is all the Southeast plant pathologists and even me sat down. We talk about what products work and what they work for, gray mold versus anthracnose. This is a very important thing to look at. Not every one of these products works for both. A good example is Kenya. I get a lot of questions about Kenya. Some people try to use it by themselves, but look at this. Excellent for gray mold, not effective at all for anthracnose. So if you end up using that sometime in early May, late April, it can be a recipe for disaster because you think you're getting efficacy on anthracnose, but you're really not. So this is a very important table, has all your FRAC groups perfect for, it's even got it color coded, makes it easy for me to see it. So you can actually make sure that you're going through here and switching up what you're using. So the first thing we always get questions about is considering your pre-bloom application. If you get some, a lot of rain and start getting spikes of warm air before your plants are going to wake up, then you can think about doing something like Captan or Thiram and Roverol. The big deal with this Roverol I have here is you cannot spray Roverol on flowers that you plan to fruit. So if you have flowers out there that you're going to take to fruit, you cannot spray it. It's off label. So some people like to use it. I would only consider it really early in March when you're, it's just got warm. We're getting a lot of rain. My plants aren't woken up yet. Really, I think I'm going to get a freeze to kill these off, but you could get some botrytis crown rot, and that's what that's affecting with, or it's what it's helping with. When we talk about this spray program, you want to make sure you're protecting blooms at least every 7 days. And I say at least because I'm going to talk a little bit about rain fastness in a second. But you want some type of protective or systemic fungicide out there every 7 days at a minimum. And you can tighten that interval some if you're starting to get a lot of rains, especially if you put out something like Captan and Elevate, which are both protectives and they don't move in the plant. Then you get a huge rain. Then you may need to spray 4 or 5 days after that. But at least every 7 days, you want to be putting out an application. You want to make sure your applications are effective for both botrytis fruit rot and anthracnose fruit rot. That's what I have BFR and AFR there. But gray mold and anthracnose, I would say you want at least a good on each. And so if you put out something like just Captan, it's good on both. You can put out Captan by itself, but I would say you always want to add something in that. Usually that's why we say Captan plus maybe Elevate. There it is down at the bottom. So a lot of times what we'll recommend, or say you put out Switch, and you can add Captan in there just to give another mode of action to work with it. But I say at least good, but whenever you're at high risk, you want to have something that's excellent for both. That's what I would say. And so if you have something with poor anthracnose efficacy, that's where you start adding in Captan together with it to get both. And so that's, like I said, Kenya. You want to use Kenya, I would add in Captan with it just to make sure you're getting at least some anthracnose, especially when you start getting a little bit later in the season. The other thing is rotate your effective modes of action. There's a lot of resistance bouncing around out there. And one thing people always say is, well, I'm not building resistance on my farm. Well, that's fine and dandy. But say you put out something like Captan and Elevate. Well, there's resistance to Elevate out there. And then say you put it out again and again. Well, you may not be getting any additional efficacy beyond what your Captan's giving you, because if it's the plants you brought in, if those plants have some resistance, or say the botrytis that came in with your plants has resistance to Elevate, then you just put out 2 or 3 applications in a row where you didn't get any increase in efficacy. You wasted your money on the fungicide as well. But if you rotated in something like Switch, then you were kind of safeguarding yourself by doing that rotation. So make sure you're rotating at least every week to something different. You can bounce back every 2 sprays, not so bad, but at least every week. And then spray through the last harvest, especially if it's starting to get hot and it's raining. You really got to protect against that anthracnose. And what I would say is start looking at products that are going to give you more anthracnose efficacy toward the back end. Usually what that means is things that have these group 11 fungicides. So Pristine, Maravon, Luna Sensation. These are the 3 that I say you can really go towards the back end. A new one is Miravis Prime. I don't even know if we can get it here or not yet, But check the label, make sure it's labeled for you. I believe it's labeled in Arkansas now, but it wasn't everywhere last time I checked. But you can see that's even a new 12 plus a 7. So it takes that 12 that's in the switch and adds into the 7, which is giving us really excellent gray mold activity. But make sure you're using something towards the back of the ear that's like that. So this is the example foliar spray schedule I'm going to send around. The reason I'm calling it a foliar spray schedule is because it needs to be used during flowering. I'll probably even add that word to it. On the right, here are our max use rates, and these are the common products that I think most of you are probably spraying or considering. That's not everything, obviously, that's in the last page, but that would fill up the entire page if I tried that. But it's definitely everything that's on the spray schedule. So here I have 9 sprays. So that's in 9 weeks. I think that'll get most of you through. The most I think we put out on our variety trials is 11. And that was when we had rains every other day. And so we were spraying on 4 to 5 day intervals. I believe we put out either 8 or 9 sprays last year, and that got us all the way through the year. But you'll look at the use rates and you'll see that you can actually get out more than this, or more than 9 if you need to. So what we start off with is Cap 10 elevates excellent on botrytis or gray mold. Cap 10's good on both. So here our first spray is really good on our botrytis, pretty good on anthracnose. And you can see the modes of actions. And right away, we're swapping to a different mode of action. So we're at switch. It's excellent on botrytis, good on anthracnose. So here we have different modes of action for each of the things that we're trying to control. And we should be doing a good job early on of what our highest risk is, which is going to be anthracnose. Swap back to Cap 10 Elevate. We want to make sure we're using these mainly botrytis things towards the beginning, but still see every single week we are still at a good rating on anthracnose. Then we bring in Luna Sensation. This is a mix up of 7-11 haven't been used yet, period. So we got a really good rotation going. This is excellent on both. I really like Luna Sensation or Maravon. They're pretty equivalent. The only difference is that I could find this easier when I went to buy it. If you can buy Maravon, it's going to be just as good. The other difference is whether you get 3 or 4 applications of each. I think if you lower the rate some on Luna Sensation, you can push another application. But generally, we like to use the max rate if we can. Then I swap back to Cap 10 Elevate because we just got a really good shot of something that's a systemic and excellent on both. Now here we're back to excellent and good. Then we put out another switch just to be able to rotate it back in. You actually can get 4 applications of switch out there. We didn't use as many. We put a Cap 10 in here with it this time. So we have a excellent and good on switch, and then a good on Cap 10. So good against both anthracnose and botrytis, excellent on botrytis, and good on anthracnose. So those two combined is a pretty good shot for anthracnose, especially not too late in the year. Then we have Luna Sensation. And honestly, at this time of the year, if we had another option besides a group 11, that's probably what we would go with over and over again. We did a Cap 10 and Elevate here. You could also just throw in a switch and switch plus Cap 10 again. We actually had one more application of Cap 10 left. And then we had another application of switch. So that would probably even be the better option is Cap 10 plus switch, and then a Luna Sensation to end it out with. So you can see we rotated every single time. We only used 3 Luna Sensations, which was max rate, which is all that we were allowed to use. We still had one more switch in the tank, or maybe 2. We could actually I'll probably actually change this before I send it along to you on spray 8 to switch plus Cap 10. And that would give us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Cap 10 sprays total. And we can do 8. And so that means you have a lot of wiggle room to spray more, spray some of these products a little less. And even if you put out applications of Cap 10 in the fall, which some of you may or may not have done, we don't always recommend, then you still have a little wiggle room on that as well. The other thing I want to say is I don't have Thiram in here, but Thiram and switch are the only things that we know to be efficacious or work on Neopistolotiopsis, that new disease that most of you will not deal with, but some of you will. So having that switch and Thiram in there, or just switch here and there, that's going to help to some degree. It doesn't really work that great, but especially late in the year when it starts raining, make sure you're using switch, and you may want to throw in Thiram instead of Cap 10. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about rain fastness. What we know is that protectant fungicides wash off very easily. And so here's a picture where I've sprayed some Cap 10 on one of our, I think this was in 2020 in a trial we were doing. So the idea is that you put a protectant fungicide on here, does a pretty good job. But when it rains, I think it's even an inch of rain, you lose at least 50% of your protection on those plants. And so it's a huge deal. You're losing 50%, you're now down to a poor or fair rating. And so really it's not going to work too well after that. The caveat is you need a fungicide out here to kill spores before a rain. So what happens is you get a rainfall event. This makes the leaf material wet. And now the spores from these different pathogens can easily infect your plants. They can easily infect the flowers or the leaves, which both, flowers loses you fruit. Leaves means more of the pathogen later on to infect more of the plant, right? Or more flowers. So you need to be able to kill some of those spores and get a little protection before the rain. So a lot of times we get the question of why spray right before? It's just going to wash off and have to respray. Well, that's where you get your protection from. And you still need the protection afterward to continue to protect the flowers, but you got to have it beforehand. So that's a lot of times where when you see a lot of rain in the forecast, it's where you want to try to maximize these systemic fungicides. So that's a lot of the products that we just mentioned are systemic. There were a couple weeks actually where we had something like Captain and Elevate where you're not getting protection. So I would say the only protectant fungicides that we're listing on the spray schedule would be Captain, Elevate, and then Thyram. That's the only ones that we've listed, but things like PhD, OSO, I think those would be similar. But here's the options that are that we have out here right now. It doesn't include that newer one I mentioned earlier, but Switch, Maravon, Pristine, Luna Sensation, these are all pretty systemic. They may not move too much in the plant, but they're at least getting into the material you're trying to protect. And it's going to still give you that 7 days we talked about before. So that's what we would expect. If you're going to get a bunch of rains in the next 5 days, you put out something like Luna Sensation or Maravon, we expect that still to be there and protecting for the full 7 days that you're hoping for.